right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to Sterling Memorial Library today for Beyond Boundaries, which is the second annual symposium on hybrid scholarship at Yale. This is the second year that we've put on this symposium, and the woman who's been the real organizer of this is Katherine Derose, who many of you in the room may know as the Engagement and Outreach Manager for the Digital Humanities Lab. Katherine is often the first person that people see when they walk into the lab, and she's also responsible for the emails that many of you get or will get after you have signed in this morning, as well as her social media presence. So as we kick off Beyond Boundaries 2, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the work of Katherine Derose. Thank you. And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the work of Monica Ong-Reed, who's the user experience designer in the Digital Humanities Lab and is responsible for the second year in a row for our beautiful logo and visual identity. So thank you, Monica. So before we begin today's events, I just want to say a couple brief remarks, and those sort of center on my own experiences of Beyond Boundaries for the second year. And I think the thing that really stays with me from the first year we put this on, and I'm sure will be continuous in the second year, is that this is really a great event for two reasons. The first reason is that it brings people from across the many campuses that Yale has. The science area, the traditional core, West Campus, even the hospital. And more than just physical location, it also brings people together from all sorts of different units that are represented on this program. So if you look at the names in the program you all received, you look at the departments, you're going to see affiliations ranging from English to cognitive science to engineering science, to the Babylonian collection, the Department of Music. I think that's really great that this event brings in so many people from so many different disciplines, institutes, and centers across campus. And the second thing that stays with me from the first year, and is also represented in the program for the second year, is that this is an event that brings together folks at all different levels of scholarship. We have, of course, some professors who are going to speak today. We have distinguished curators of visual collections and physical collections. We have an amazing cohort of graduate students who are going to be talking about their work. And we also have, most importantly, a bunch of folks from Yale College who are going to be presenting today and also going to be showing some of their work in the poster session at the end of this event. So I think that's really what stays with me from these 2 years that we've done this event, is the sort of cross-disciplinary nature and also the way that this event tries to bring together folks at all different varying levels of the university. I also want to acknowledge the support of two families and groups that have been very important to the support of STEAM and digital humanities on campus. We have today in the room Rich Franke, who will be joined shortly by Barbara Franke, whose support for many units of the university and specifically the library has been really wonderful over the years, and that support is continuing with their generosity to enable the Digital Humanities Lab to have a wonderful new home in a beautiful reading room, the Franke family reading room, in the next calendar year. So thanks very much to Rich and Barbara Franke. And also I want to acknowledge the support of the Goizueta Family Foundation, whose generosity has enabled the first 3 years of the Digital Humanities Lab on Yale campus and its support for hybrid scholarship and STEAM on campus. So thanks very much to the Goizueta Foundation. So with that, I'd like to kick off our round of lightning talks. So I'm going to be introducing each person or team member as they approach. And the first is Masha Shpolberg and Andrew Vielkind, who are PhD students in respectively Comp Lit and Film and Media Studies, as well as Art History and Film and Media Studies. Andrew and Masha.
Oh, hi, everyone. So thank you, Peter, for introducing us. I'll let Andrew kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. So to begin, I would say last year, Masha and I had the privilege of participating in a year-long initiative sponsored by the Mellon Foundation on inquiring into the various techniques that we use for digital humanities. So we spent a year exploring a lot of the different techniques that we could possibly be applying to our home discipline of film studies. And so over this year-long endeavor, we were diligently trying to see like what gaps existed within our discipline and how digital tools could be used to fill them. And so the one thing we stumbled across was that we noticed how much interest there was in our field into uncovering the various distribution networks and channels of films and uncovering how films cross borders and how we might see how we might also unpack the distribution channels in a lot of nations that aren't really part of the hegemonic Western canon. And so the project we formulated together is called Cine Circuits, where we really focus on the explosive proliferation of the International Film Festival. And the phase 1 of our project, which was also generously funded by the Digital Humanities Lab for its development, focuses on how film festivals proliferate over time. And so with the seed grant we received from the lab, we were able to go through the various indexes online, various databases of the film festivals, and there are thousands of film festivals that are in existence right now, but a lot of the resources are fragmented and not easily indexed. And so our project, essentially a big data project, was to consolidate all this big data, all this information, put into our own database, sort through it, and then geo-reference everything so that it could be mapped into an interactive website using the online web-based software program called Cartodb, now known as Cartodb. And so our website will feature a mapping interface that makes a lot of this information more accessible, and so users will be able to play with it and notice their own trends and make observations about the film festivals.
And I should add that we've been very lucky to work with an undergraduate, Abhishek Nair, who's in the computer science program and who's been helping us with a lot of the coding. The website isn't available yet, but I brought some visuals just to explain a little bit of what we've been doing. So basically, we've spent the whole year so far coming up with an API code that would enable us to get information offline to create a kind of fundamental database of all festivals. And then once we did that, we started thinking, okay, how can we sort through this data to cut through it to come up with some significant research? And so I just wanted to present 2 short little findings. We thought something really fun would be to try to figure out when did certain genres of cinema really take off? Because that's something you can do when you have this amount of data. And so we thought, horror film festivals, why not? Something a little bit fun. And so we compiled a database of horror film festivals. We were curious to learn that they only really kick off in 1981, which is interesting. And we also looked at children's film festivals, which kick off a little bit earlier in 1961. And so part of what we want to do is there's been a kind of the dominant paradigm for understanding film festivals has been that of national cinemas, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is to break the national cinemas paradigm to think about films as a transnational, constantly moving thing. And so here's a video that we made. So 1 second of this video, it's a 28-second video, is equal to every 2 years from 1961 to 2016. And so this shows the proliferation of children's film festivals around the world. And as you'll see, they start off in Europe, and there's kind of a lull. And then there's more and more. And so basically something that we were able, and here's a zoom in on Europe because there's so many European festivals. And so something that kind of became interesting and apparent to us is we thought that we would see a big Cold War dynamic that would somehow be determining right where these festivals were, but in effect, a lot of them were in middle Europe, in these kinds of middle zones. So the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, etc. And the second thing that we noticed, in addition to the geographical kinds of findings that we can find, is also these temporal golden eras. So the golden era for the Children's Film Festival ends up being 1991 to 2006, which was also very interesting. And so once we get these kinds of small findings, we can start thinking about the different forces shaping the festival circuit and shaping contemporary cinema. So this is the map of horror film festivals. And again, there's one and a big lull. And so something interesting about horror film festivals is that even though they start off in Europe, they're really big in North America and not at all big, for example, in the former Eastern European countries, right? You don't see any there. You see very few in South America. And so we're able to think about different kinds of cultural dynamics by being able to process this amount of data in this way. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Hieronimus. I'm a junior psychology major, and today I'm going to be talking about media trends in mental health, how we use the New York Times API to track word use surrounding mental illness. And so going into this project, my research mentor and I were curious about two questions, like how frequently do people talk about mental health and mental illness throughout history in the media? And how do those rates of word use compare between specific types of mental illness versus, and between mental versus physical illness? And so to do this, we use the New York Times article search API. We use this particular New York Times API for two reasons, because we thought that the New York Times is like a pretty popular newspaper, and so it would be fairly representative as a sample of what the news media in particular points in history would be talking about. And the second reason is because it's just a very well-developed API, has a lot of resources. And so this API has a database of over 16 million articles that are sourced from the New York Times itself, routers, and the Associated Press, going all the way back to 1851. And so to get the data from this API, from this database, we had to use a Python script to make the JSON call to the API with our search parameters, our search terms, and then we got back this specific data on headlines, we got the abstracts, keywords, web URLs, and there was a lot of other data that could be get. And so after we made the Python script, we used it to query for our specific search terms. And these search terms could be like mental illness. And we could also use modifiers, so we could be like veterans and PTSD, veterans and PTSD, but not Iraq. And so we got the data on how many articles per year contain the term. And then we plotted the percentage of articles by year using our, and by percentage of articles, that's the number of articles that contain our search term divided by the total number of articles for that year on any topic. And so using this method, we wrote a correspondence paper to an article originally in the Lancet Psychiatry. So this psychiatrist in the UK talked about how people nowadays are replacing the word mental health with mental illness out of political correctness or whatever it is. So people would say like mental health concerns, mental health issues, instead of mental illness. And that's problematic. He argued that's problematic because it downgrades the severity of mental illness and treats it as like a mental, an issue instead of like illness. And so we thought, yeah, that certainly is a problem. We wanted to know more about the problem and like when this shift in the usage of language, like mental health versus mental illness, when that happened. So that's what we did using our New York Times API tool, and this is what we found. So the red line is mental health and the blue line is mental illness. As you can see, like mental health has always been used more frequently in a greater percentage of articles use the word mental health than mental illness, and it's been this way since 1940. And as opposed to one word replacing the other, both of them are correlated. The correlation coefficient was something like 0.75, and that just goes to show like it actually wasn't, like mental health isn't replacing mental illness, it's just always been used more frequently. And so, yeah, we responded to that paper and using our data, we backed up that claim, like what you're saying from your observations, like isn't actually backed up by data from the like news media. And so we also happen to compare the word use and rate of mental illness, mental health, or behavioral health, and compare it with mentions of diabetes and hypertension. So we just wanted to know, like, in the news media, what do people talk about? What is popular as a disease to talk about? And mental health and illness, well, it is a very broad category, so it encompasses like depression, PTSD, like a lot of mental illnesses, but it is more popular than diabetes as a topic, and hypertension. And so why should you care about this? What are the implications? I think that like frequency of term usage and being able to know how often people use words in the media is relevant to any humanities field, because you can see like you can see how often people are using it in newspapers, and then you get a reflection of how often words are being used in the general public. And besides the New York Times, there are also APIs for The Guardian, NPR, and Bloomberg. And these are also like well-developed APIs that function similarly. And you might be wondering, like, what's the difference between what we did and like Google Books Ngrams? But the difference is that we just have more customizability with our process, and we also get access to newspapers, which I think reflect the general public's consumption better than the scientific articles or the books that might be more obscure that are reflected by Ngrams. And so besides the hits, we also got access to article content. Like I said before, we got the headlines, we got the abstracts, and we got the web URLs. We just really scratched the tip of the iceberg with this project, because we could have gone in another direction, and that is to do sentiment analysis on the articles themselves. So what we were thinking, but didn't actually do, is we could have used the web URLs to scrape the articles' bodies, and then parse the article bodies to determine whether something was talking about the topic positively or negatively. It can give a score. Sentiment analysis gives a score for how positive or negative an article is based on the words they use. And so, yeah, I would like to thank Adam Checkrud. He's my research mentor, our PI, Greg McCarthy, and our advisor, Dr. John Crystal. And here's the reference to the paper that we wrote that the figures came from, and here's the GitHub repo with our Python tool, so anyone could go on there and recreate what we did. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I now have the pleasure of introducing Kim Andrews, who's going to be speaking on Everything is Joan Baez, Networking the Counterculture.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much for coming. It's great to see all of you here. So my topic is actually more about pedagogy, really, than anything else. So just to prepare you for that. So last semester, Professor John Williams, who's also in the English department, and I sat down to try and figure out how we might integrate digital humanities components into a lecture-style course on the American counterculture in the 1960s and 70s. English 195. As a lecture course, such integration was bound to come with a few challenges particular to the class format. Learning across sections would have to be standardized in some way, and a certain amount of lecture time would have to be devoted to skills training without overshadowing the literary content of the course. This time crunchiness, as we know, is one of the major hurdles that anyone working in DH has to find a way to jump over. In our case, I was the one with the most time, and so we started, perhaps counterintuitively, with me. Taking the folks at the DH lab at their very generous word, I had applied for the fellowship knowing very little about DH methods, but I was generally familiar with network graphs that looked like hairballs and topic maps that looked like acid trips. Acid trips would have fit the theme of the course quite well, but we didn't have a secondary corpus to work with. We just had the syllabus. So I got to work trying to figure out what we might do with the corpus we had, that is the collection of writers and thinkers that our students would be reading and writing and thinking with, etc. Using Gephi, which is a network visualization tool, I made a map of the syllabus itself, which wound up looking like this. Now you can't see this very well, but it doesn't really matter. As you can sort of see, the course readings wound up being split between like 2.5 groups. Right, there's a beat-centered one, which is centered on Allen Ginsberg, which is like up at the top there. All the orange lines are the connection there at the Naropa University, or Naropa, like Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, right, in Colorado. And there is another little group, which is like over there, it's on the far side, centered on Thomas Pynchon, and all of the green lines there, that's just reading relationships. They, either may or may not have known each other personally. And then there's this huge group, right? Big, huge blob of philosophers and writers and scientists connected by their affiliation with the Esalen Institute in California. And those are all of the pink, kind of purpley pink lines that you can see there. George Spencer Brown, Timothy Leary, etc. Right? What a visualization like this does, which is what we found out in class, is to give the students an interesting kind of insight into how we as teachers build our courses. In this case, John's interest in a very particular West Coast-centered version of the American counterculture became clear in a way that would have unfolded more slowly, or perhaps less usefully, or perhaps not at all, without the fact of the graph. It also allowed us to think about writing projects that might incorporate this kind of broad thinking about course structure. And to that end, we developed a final project for the class that involved asking students to research a figure that wasn't on the syllabus, but could have been, and to make their case in the form of a dedicated course press website. Thank you very much, Trip Kirkpatrick. In order to facilitate this kind of syllabus-level thinking, I decided to do two things. One, to make a data entry worksheet for students to fill out, and two, to use that student-generated data to make a new syllabus network with all of their figures incorporated into it. I did the first thing in order to give students a taste of what data entry for networking software looked and felt like without overwhelming them, a facet of learning digital tools that I think tends to get overlooked when we talk about integrating these sorts of technologies into humanities classrooms. Here's what that looked like. All right, this is what I had them do. Obviously not with Batman. In Gephi, people and things get turned into numbers, right? You can see that on the worksheet, that the software uses to plot the network. And there's a column for the nature of the relationship or the connection that you can also fill in. So my version of the syllabus network, which I did on my own, right, looked a bit like this. So this is what the actual Excel spreadsheet looked like, right? So you can see the nodes, those are the people, we decided to do gender and then profession and then the connections, right? So they turn into numbers, undirected, and then the method, or the nature of the relationship, so Esalen Institute friendship, they reading relationship, friendship, etc. Right. In Gephi, no wait, sorry. So you'll notice that on the worksheet, however, I didn't give any instructions, so you can see this. I didn't actually give them any instructions as to what kind of connections counted as connections between the students' figures and the syllabus, or how many to find, or how many words to use, or whatever. I didn't do any of that. So as a result, the data I got looked like this. Right, so you have everything here from actual friendship to referenced in a painting subtitle. This looks like a disaster, and in some ways it is. I hadn't thought about consistency across multiple students doing data entry, and so of course you get a mess like this. But in hindsight, if I had to change it, I wouldn't. The messiness produced a graph that was instructionally misleading. Because one student working on Joan Baez had interpreted connection really loosely and had thus found a relatively large number of connections, we wound up with a new syllabus visualization in which Joan Baez was the center of the universe. Obviously, this is not an accurate representation of how everyone and everything being researched or read in the class was connected, but it is an accurate representation of discrepancies in assignment interpretation. And that is interesting on its own. Ultimately, the students produced course press sites that obviously that absorbed some of the work that I'd been doing semi-behind the scenes. One student, for instance, made an analog version of a network graph of the movie Inherent Vice, which was hilarious. Right? That's what that looked like. And one student produced a wildly non-linear series of vignettes about David Foster Wallace. This was very cool, where just like there were like 8 million links in this course press site. The discussions about the course as a course, which helped to produce these projects, would have been nearly unthinkable without some way of bird's eye viewing the readings. And while that view remains, for me, not enough, I am, for better or for worse, still a big believer in actually reading individual texts themselves carefully as part of a holistic way of helping students think about their courses, not as sets of readings handed down to them from on high, but as lists of possibilities put together by fellow humans. I am all about messy data, bad graphs, and lengths of string. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Job Sankofa, who's going to be speaking on delinquent migrations, mapping Black itinerant youth, labor, and incarceration in California from 1929 to 1939.
Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank the DHL Lab for a seed grant, and also a phenomenal undergraduate student who helped me, Serena Lau, who helped me with the data entry and mapping. And so, delinquent migrations is a part of a larger project to look at counter-public migrations that occurred in the post-emancipation era all the way up until World War II. And so, this chapter traces the lives of 7 young Black males who left home between the ages of 9 years old to start working up until the age of 15. And so I'm going to scroll through the first 6, and I'm going to do a micro history of one of the individuals. And so this website is incorporated also with like documentary. And so I'm gonna scroll past that. So, and so this right here is 7 young people, and as you can see, the earliest left in 1896, and some of these were all of these people were. So 7 young people, and as we can see, typically migration stories are like one place to another or one place to this, but they don't sort of show the unsettledness of some people's migration stories. And so, as we can see here, this young man, Joseph Hoggett, at 8 years old, both his parents died. At 9 years old, he was taken in by a family, and he ran away at 9 years old and began working. And following race stables as an exercise boy. And so he ends up going through New Orleans to New York, and he ends up in the American West by like age 15. And he ended up going to prison for something he didn't do. And so partly what I'm trying to do here is also show that what differs between young people's migration stories is a lot of times the push-pull factors. And so typically the Great Migration story is about fathers, mothers, families leaving, going from one place to the other, heads of households. But it's never from the narrative of young people who were displaced, who ran away, or who were actually running away from their home in terror in their home. And so this young man, he left home at age 14. And as you can see, this map follows him almost, he's in his 40s. And as you can see, the first red line is the first place that he goes. And he's born in Carthage, Texas, and he leaves home at 14. And as you can see, he was a little bit everywhere. Okay, and so this other person, Willie Cannon, was born in 1900 in Fulton, Arkansas, and he left, and he actually went to the Midwest first. He went to St. Louis, then he went to Chicago, and he left home at 14 as well. And so he goes to Iowa, and then he goes to the West. And as you can see, he goes back to Arkansas, and then he goes back to California. And from there, he ends up running into the law and having a hard time eventually. And so this person, who's born in Tennessee, he goes to Detroit. So at 12 years old, this person, his mother died when he was 11. His father put him out at 12 years old and said he had to fend for himself. And so at 12 years old, he went all the way to Detroit. And I try to imagine, like 12 years old, leaving home, going to Detroit, and then starting his journey, going to Chicago, and then, as you can see, he goes back to Tennessee, and eventually, on his way out west, he's charged with vagrancy in Utah. Okay, and I'm gonna come back to this person because I do a micro history. So this person, as you can see, he was born in Purcell. So his father went to prison when he was 4 years old. His mother remarried, which he says made his life miserable. And so he began running away at the age of 11 years old. And then he went to a reformatory school. And so one of the important things here that I want to note is that running away from home is actually against the law. It's a crime. So In other words, these youth are fugitives. Once they leave home, they're actually under the threat of being incarcerated or sent to state reformatory schools. And so he's sent to a state reformatory school, he gets out, and eventually he just runs away to California, Sacramento, and he begins to labor in the farm fields of Sacramento at 14 years old. And so if we can imagine a 14-year-old also running away all the way to Sacramento, and he runs away in around 1934, so this is the Great Depression. Okay. And this is a micro history of this person, James Smith. And James Smith, his migration pattern is called the trap. And I'll tell you why, so I'll introduce you. Just, here's a little. Nobody knows you when you're down in. James Smith was born July 15, 1950. He was orphaned at 11 years of age when both his parents died. Soon after, he began following the farm labor from Tennessee, the U.S. South, and across the American West. Like many itinerant youth, James lived a precarious life hopping trains to search for work. His journey sheds light on the consequences of being a young black male looking for work, particularly in Alabama and Texas, where he was captured and imprisoned for vagrancy. After surviving hard labor in southern jails, James followed farm labor into California. James arrived in California in the midst of the Great Depression, at a time when anti-vagrancy laws and border patrol were being strictly enforced due to the influx of indigenous Southwestern migrants. Nearly everywhere James Smith looked for work, he was jailed. Seasonal box labor and racial hiring practices in California trapped James with a revolving door of short-term work on being punished by being unemployed. To the narrative of James Smith, the story of black itinerant is unfolding to uncover the operation of agricultural capitalism, surplus labor, and imprisonment in California. Itinerant laborers were an excess labor force, accessible when farm unions were on strike, yet neglected and subjected to exploitation in the private and public labor markets. The criminalization of unemployment funneled James into low-wage work as a convenient, dispensable class of workers. Sometimes his labor was welcome, at other times James was told to disappear or float out of regions. To survive, James committed non-violent petty crimes, which placed him in a never-ending cycle of incarceration and unfree labor. The trap traces James' work incarceration over 11 years. By age 23. So I'm going to scroll past that and just come to James's migration pattern. And so one thing also, so think about California, why California and is the trap. So California, like many other places, have vagrancy laws, and vagrancy laws criminalize people in public places like young people, African Americans. At this time, other groups are racialized different, so you have people like Italians, you have like sex workers, all of these different issues to counteract people's presence. And so in California, you can be charged with vagrancy for being unemployed, you can be charged with vagrancy for being homeless, you can be charged with vagrancy from roaming from place to place. So all of these things created a trap for an itinerant laborer like James. And so these yellow marks right here is, so we mapped 19 people from the archive who had vagrancy charges all across the country. So in 37 different cities, we found people through records in California that were arrested for vagrancy charges across the country. And so at this time, 41 states have vagrancy charges, and at least 37 have vagrancy charges for those who are unemployed. And so you can imagine someone who's in harvest labor that's very seasonal and what it's like to be in California at a time. And so James was in California in the Great Depression. So you have farm labor strikes going on, you have Southwestern migrants, so you have like this anti-migration campaign that's going on. And so this right here also is a very interactive thing. So this is, you can overlay it with the railroads. And as you can see, the closer you get, you see the railroads, and you see like these different places. Like James was arrested here in Tucson. He's arrested right here in Imperial Valley. And the closer you kind of get in, you can see different, you can see California where it's not just a blur, but these are different places that people are being criminalized. And so the reason why James is important is this map right here shows just how unsettled it was. And so as James began to go up into California laboring, he's going into places and he's being charged with vagrancy and he's being kicked out of that region. And so then he goes to another region and then he's charged with vagrancy again and then he's kicked out. And so James, when he first commits a burglary because he said he needed food to eat, he's given 15 years probation and he's given 1 year on a road camp and then told to leave the state and never come back. So James ends up coming back and being charged with vagrancy again, and then he's sent back to LA County because of probation violation, because remember, he's kicked out of the state for 15 years. So then he ends up coming back, and as you can see, something's pulling him up into the farms of California, but he keeps being kicked out for vagrancy, and he has like this 15-year sentence over his head. And so eventually he comes back, and of course it's the Great Migration, it's the Great Depression, and so he's caught up in this trap. And the importance of trying to really articulate migrants who would come from other states is that once you get arrested and sent to prison, there's family estrangement. There's no phones to call home. And some of these young people hadn't seen their parents in over 14 years. And the first time they were able to even sit down and write a letter to a family may have been 10 or 15 years later when they were in prison, because their lives were so precarious. And a lot of times they were under the threat of not only vagrancy charges, but also just roaming through different places. And so it's very important, I think, to shed light on the young people's narratives, because they weren't going with fathers and mothers. They were alone, so they had to find food. And a lot of times, many of the public spaces are very criminalized. And so the mapping part helped me kind of understand geographies of survival and trying to better understand how different people survived being on the road without their families, and also under the threat of increased surveillance, increased incarceration, and well as the criminalization of poverty. And so it's not only just black youth that are being criminalized, it's pretty much a lot of poor youth during the Great Depression particularly. And so the black story is very important, because in California we don't typically hear about black migrant laborers in the harvest fields, and also much of the Great Migration that talks about African Americans in California is told through the lens of middle class and other people who we can trace their lives. You can't trace the lives of people who are poor or who are always constantly moving because of the surveillance of police or because you couldn't be homeless in public. And so putting traces of their lives together broadens the conversation about the Great Migration. And so this is a part of a larger project, Delinquent Migrations. Thank you.
Thanks for that wonderful presentation. Next, we have Rachel Ahn and Jake Colavolpe, who are going to be speaking to us about preserving history and memory, databasing American public sculptures.
Yeah, so Jake and I are going to talk to you a little bit about American public sculptures and the work we've been doing in that area. So just as an introduction, Jake and I last semester took this great class with Professor Laura Wexler, which was an inaugural course in Yale University and Smithsonian partnership. So it was a really cool class. We got access to their Save the Outdoor Sculpture database, which was started in the 1990s, and it was a very big public initiative almost, where 7,000 volunteers collected information about their community's sculptures. And it was to generate appreciation, enthusiasm, and just a general sense of preservation for what we have. So that was really cool, but they found that more than 32,000 public sculptures needed conservation or maintenance. And also what we found looking through their data was furthermore that most of the work was done in the 90s. So there was inaccurate GPS technology, poor quality photos, and the sculptures have moved since then. So after the class was over, we decided to take on this project where we update it and also see what more we can do with it with today's technology.
Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of processes that we've been using to actually make this data into something that is usable and visualizable for us, by us, for the community. So the first thing that we're using is Cartodb. We are having an active database, so about every hour when we're updating our database, it pushes to this live map, which we'll show you in a little bit, which basically shows you where the sculpture is exactly, who sculpted it, when it was sculpted, any historical facts that might be important to it, and accurately placing that on the map. As Rachel said, a lot of these places a lot of these sculptures did not have the correct coordinates, as it was done in the early 90s. We found this when we were looking at the sculptures in New Haven, and 47 sculptures were in the exact same spot. We knew something wasn't exactly correct. The second thing that we're working on doing too is also taking some of these sculptures and making 3D models of them, both for conservation and for preservation. This is not a public sculpture. This is the Clark Memorial in the Grove Street Cemetery. What we're doing is creating these sort of 3D models in Agisoft Photoscan and MeshLab, taking these sort of 3D photogrammetry softwares and making them as accessible as possible, sort of showing folks that, like, hey, what this project was in the 90s, you could do this now. You can make a fully rotating and printable 3D sculpture of things that you have in your community that you care so much about.
Yeah, so next up to the SOS. So what we've been doing currently is orienting the database with the public in mind. So just 2 screenshots. The top is what the Smithsonian gave us. So to us, it was kind of counterintuitive. They gave us creator 1, which is the sculptor, creator 2, if there was a second sculptor, the creator firm, and then the title, alternate title, date, dimensions, and then locations way on after. And most people don't really care about who the creators were unless they were big name sculptors. So what we've been doing is we've made the title of the sculptures first. So the Vietnam War Memorial, if someone wants to go see it, they type it in, it's the first thing. And then we give them the location, the exact coordinates. And the first 2 columns is just for us only, doesn't have to worry about it. And what's really great is, for example, with the New Haven County Courthouse, they have 5 sculptures around it. So 2 on the front and 3 on the side. So if people are interested in seeing it, we give them the exact side and the exact location where they are. And the second thing is we're talking about starting a project to raise greater awareness. So maybe that's 3D printing some of our favorite sculptures that we have around us. Or maybe that's creating an application that people can have on their phones to see where things are, go visit it, and take personal notes.
All right, so hopefully this, oh no. Oop, yeah, we'll do this. So I want to walk y'all through the map real quick. Oop, I don't want to close that out. Cool, oh no, okay. So we're working on cleaning this up a little bit. As you can see, they're sort of all just popping up now. But let's say we want to look at the children. It's not where, oh no, here we go, great, okay. So you see it pops up here. You get the location on the physical map, the sculptor, the medium, and when it was sculpted. And what this is great for is, one, not only eventually making this more public, as you can see, I think, from our data as well. The Smithsonian, while it was a public project, got that data sort of for themselves. I think you can tell in the way the data was oriented. For us, we're sort of trying to take that public data that was collected by 7,000 volunteers and making it, again, for public consumption. So part of the creation of this map is to do that. And secondly, it allows us to sort of see sculptural trends. And so one thing I was really surprised about, it does not do this on my computer, all right, is that there's a huge cluster, I think you can see right here, and I was talking to Rachel and I was like, no, that can't be right? Like they can't all be in the same spot. Turns out there's this great thing in a pretty small town in Connecticut called Monument, what is it?
Like Monument Boulevard?
Monument Boulevard. This has a bunch of war memorials on it, right? These are some things that we would not have known because the data was kind of fudged before we started touching it. All right, let's jump back into this PowerPoint. So that's our map. As we wanted to talk a little bit as well, just sort of why this sort of thing is important. So Rachel, do you want to talk about the Discobolus?
Yeah, so one of the first things is updating it. And one of the sculptures listed in Connecticut was this thing called Discobolus by Robert Cronin. And I was looking for it and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I did a Google search of it. And in 2007, I found this newsletter for Whitman College called The Fountain, where they talked about how they had this brand new new sculpture and how they were so excited about it. So it's actually in Walla Walla, Washington right now. And the move that happened about a decade ago, but hasn't been noted. So just small things like that, like the movement of sculptures is really common, and also just a lot of updating the work that's been done.
I love that I left "there's a term for this, find it" on this slideshow. Anyway, so talking a little bit again about what the difference between private and public actually means, and what public means and for whom. When we're thinking about the sort of politics of the space that exists, we have a place like Yale, whose sculptures are on this database, but whose campus is not actually truly public. Sure, anyone can go see Habakkuk by WLH at any point of time, but they're not wed to the sort of same permanence that sculptures have. And so making sure that they're on this database to make them more public, also to have them be tracked so that, again, they can't just move it to Washington and the Smithsonian doesn't find out for 25 years until we are the people who are looking at this data. The Smithsonian had no idea that this wasn't in Connecticut. They're also moving the Calder that's by Commons, right? And so when we take something very, very public, like the Calder that's outside of Commons, and move that, because when it's becoming the Schwarzman Center, they're like digging and building glass there, so they're moving the Calder. Where is that going to go, right? The importance of having a database like this is to say, we know where it is now, and as long as it's staying constantly updated, it will always be available to the public, or else we risk it not being public and moving into the private realm when it's on private property. We found a lot of sculptures that have not only been moved, but also been destroyed. There was a school that was sold to a private company, became a nursing home, and they actually tore down a sculpture because they thought it was ugly. That sculpture's gone now, and again, this wasn't something that was known for 25 years. And the last thing is that when there is such a big risk of cuts to arts and humanity funding with the NHA and the NEH, all of these sorts of things mean that it's always more and more important to make sure that the public is experiencing these sculptures, this public art, and also getting people engaged in the art that is in their communities, but also, simultaneously, letting people decide what art is important in their communities. Having a database that is accessible and buildable by the people who live in particular places allows them to also add to this, to visit sculptures within their community, to appreciate them, and to care for them.
Yeah. Special thanks.
Yeah, so thank you to Laura Wexler, who I'm not sure is here this morning, but truly amazing, wonderful, visionary woman. Katherine Derose, thank you so much for just like letting us, you're here, where are you? Oh, you're back there. For just letting us like occupy the DH lab like all the time. Then Stefan, Simone, and Goze Akoglu for their help with the sort of Agisoft and Mesh Lab portion. Okay. Thank you.
Cool.
Wonderful. Thanks to Rachel and Jake. So next, I'd like to invite up a trio of presenters, Elizabeth Coquillet, Ivy Lee, and Julia Tofan, who are going to be speaking on process and context, the characterization of pictorialist photographs using raking light imaging and X-ray fluorescent spectrography. There you go.
So hi, I'm Ivy, this is Elizabeth and Julia, and we will be presenting on Yale's Princeton Pictorialist Photography Project. So the objective of our project was to scientifically determine, verify, or correct the identification of photographic processes in a collection of 70 photographic prints from the early late 19th and early 20th century, before photographic processes were visually determined, and we wanted a more scientific, accurate way to determine and identify the photographic processes. So what is pictorialist photography? Pictorialist photography was a movement that sought to elevate photography as more of an art form and not just a tool for recording history. And Clarence White, whose photographs we were analyzing in this project, was a leading proponent of pictorialism, and he was a teacher who actually trained many of the leading photographers during this time. And his collections were a part of the Princeton University art collection, and we did this project on behalf of an exhibition that they had at their Princeton Art Museum. So So the types of photography that we looked at in our project included gum bichromate, cyanotype, platinum, and palladium, and these processes all have different chemical compositions specific to the type of process. And as you can see, a lot of these processes you can sort of visually determine. For example, cyanotype is characteristically blue, but for example, with platinum and palladium, you really can't tell the difference just by looking at it. So a lot of what we sought to do was to really distinguish these different types of prints. So the way that we went about determining the processes scientifically was through a technology called X-ray fluorescence, or XRF. And how it works is that we have this X-ray gun that we pointed at the prints, and the X-ray gun irradiates X-rays that would excite the electrons in the inner orbitals of an atom, and this would excite the electrons and dislodge it. And so, in order to regain stability, the atom would fill in the vacancy that the electron left with an electron from an outer shell. And when this happened, this released an energy that was equivalent to the difference in the quantum shells that the electron was moving between. And this was very this energy difference is very specific to different types of elements. And by doing this, we were able to determine which type of elements were involved in the different photographs that we were analyzing.
So this is what the data readout from XRF measurements looks like. So as you can see, there's different peaks and they correspond to specific elements. So in order for us to determine elements that were actually part of the imaging material rather than part of the paper or other supports, we had to take two measurements for each print, one in the D-min area, which you would know is just the lightest part of the image, which has the smallest amount of imaging material, and one in the Dmax, or darkest part of the image, which has the most imaging material. So you can see the Dmax measurement is the dark blue on this, and the Dmin is the light blue. So when there is a big difference in the amount of an element in the Dmax or the Dmin, that's an indication that the element is part of the actual imaging material. So as you can see here, I've labeled the bits that were in the imaging material for this particular print. And you can see the principal elements were chromium and iron, which are characteristic of a gum dichromate print. So that's how we identified this one. And this is an example of a palladium print, which actually this was one of the ones that was falsely identified as platinum, but then we changed the identification to palladium. So palladium and mercury are characteristic of this type of print. And then also, just to point out, the elements that were found in the paper itself are also important to record because it's also information about materials the artist used. So these elements here are ones that were found in the paper of this print. And then, so we tested 70 prints, and out of that, for 22 of the prints, we identified a medium that was different than the one that had been identified visually. So you could call that an error rate in the catalog of 31%, which we were able to correct.
So in addition to looking at the chemical makeup of the photographs, we wanted to gain a better understanding of the specific types of paper particular to Clarence White's photography. So we used microscopy techniques and image processing and pattern recognition algorithms to find clusters of similar paper across time periods. So these are the raw images we captured of a 1 centimeter section of each photograph in the lightest area of the photograph, least affected by different photographic materials. And we process the images to remove the influence of color and get these more normalized images that we can compare between each other to find patterns in the texture. So we created an affinity chart of, we created an affinity chart and we were able to find clusters of similar types of textures in the paper, and we used this data to compare the chemical makeup. the chemical makeup we got from XRF data to the physical data that we got from the microscopy data. And we can use this baseline of data to categorize photographic prints, and other institutions can use this data as well. So this is our affinity chart, and you can see the areas of high affinity in which we found similar textures and significance, and our acknowledgements.
So we'd like to thank Aniko Bezer, Pablo Lindero, and Paul Messier, who are here today, who helped organize this project and led us through a lot of the science behind it, as well as the historical significance. And we'd also like to thank the other students who worked along with us in this project, Jake Colavolpe, Colin Hemez, and Rachel Ahn, who are here today. And Rachel and Jake actually just presented before us. And we'd also like to thank the professors, the graduate students, and the curators at the Princeton University Art Museum who let us work on their photographs. And John Atherton, who's also here, who's the West Campus Communications Officer. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to Elizabeth, Ivy, and Julia. Our last presenter will be Summer Sutton, who will be presenting on the Mind Design tool.
So I'm going to be talking about the Mind Design tool, which is a brain-computer interface that I'm developing as part of a Yale HP Blended Realities grant that I received this academic year. I'm a first-year architecture PhD student here, and before coming to Yale, I was an architect. And as a designer, our primary goal is to translate information that comes from imaginary visions, creative processes, and turn it into a physical reality. It's very hard to actually translate that information when the way people view objects and symbols is very subjective, dependent on cultural interpretations and exposure. The way I'm trying to leapfrog this subjectivity in design is going directly to neurological activity and translating that data into a 3D form. The way I'm approaching it is using an EEG brain scanner. And this is the real one. Now, these EEG brain scanners are a lot more consumer friendly. You can see that there are about 14 channels that read different parts of the brain. In many labs, the EEG brain headset uses a lot more nodes, but this allows us to at least experiment on a consumer level in the same way that 3D printers are being made more accessible through more economic means and simplification. So this is a great start to manipulating data that comes from neurological activity. Looking at a kind of unconscious collective understanding of forms and lines psychologically associated with emotions, I'm trying to develop this idea based on a user being able to manipulate the development of a form through their own chosen type of stimuli that will create some sort of cognitive activity. And I have a quick video that explains the process of creating a form using the EEG brain scanner. data with emotional responses. We can create a program that can manipulate a form in a way that is connected to possible emotional reactions or stimuli. Working with a basic block, I'm manipulating points on a block in the X, Y, and Z axis based on the degree of variance in the data that's being taken, collected by the EEG brain set. And using Python, we're able to manipulate that form. And then that form can be 3D printed. So in the end, you have an object. You have an object that physically represents what is happening cognitively in your mind. And I was proposing that you could create GIFs for people that represent your kind of emotional reaction to any sort of stimuli. And so a person can physically hold a representation of your ideas and thoughts and feelings. As this actually applies to what I really want to talk about today with architecture and conservation, what would happen in the opposite effect? Instead of building physical objects from neurological data, what if we think of the imagination as a void? And so we're not building based on the imagination, but we're taking away based on the imagination. And the reason I think this is important is because we have been concerned recently over the destruction of historical monuments in Syria and Iraq. And what does it mean to be actually concerned about that removal of a physical object that we may never actually see, and our only connection with those objects is through images in textbooks or images that we see online. So why are we so affected by its physical destruction in a place that we may never go to? If you were walking into the room, you might have seen in the hallway, there's been a previous project that 3D prints the ruins of Palmyra, and that's used as an example of how 3D printing can help educate people about these monuments that you may never get to see or that are eventually destroyed. Looking at this wall in Nineveh, Iraq, as just an example, this wall has been destroyed, and people are, of course, concerned over the destruction of this cultural heritage monument. But, of course, in the history of this monument, it's been destroyed plenty of times by various powers that are trying to take over control. So is destruction really something that we're trying to constantly erase when it's something that constantly happens? Or do we accept it as part of the heritage and the history of the physical object? The destruction and decay of architectural monuments.
My name is Summer Sun. Thank you for watching this video cover letter that I put together. Currently, I'm an assistant professor of architecture at
You can find this online as well if you want to watch it later. It talks about this work as well. The beautification of ruins and destruction has been a constant theme since the 18th century. We have a fascination with them. It's an indication of time that's passed. It's an indication of man versus nature and the physical reality of conflict. In terms of 3D printing, there are a lot of benefits in 3D printing in areas of conflict and in reconstruction, especially in Iraq or Syria, the creation of prosthetics, as well as other tools and devices that are developed to create or to provide areas with limited resources, with unique objects that will help rebuild the area and recover from the conflict. In terms of architecture, what can we do with 3D printing to help these areas of conflict? And so I decided to redesign my Python coding and tool to be able to manipulate a brick, a simple brick that could be used for the reconstruction of a monument. And with the concept of removing a solid, the use of an EEG brain scanner can, based on the stimuli, manipulate this block. So when you start off with this block, in the end you can 3D print a block that represents your imagined association with a monument, your memory of the past of the monument. So it's an embodied sense of time, sense of association with the architecture element. So in the end, you can have a wall that is a mixture of the original material as well as these blocks of embodied meaning from the universe that feels impacted by the loss of the physical object of the monument. And in the end, I think that we can propose that we could turn this into something that's kind of like Kickstarter with Kiva, where when we want to build an object or rebuild a monument, it can be posted on a crowdsourcing website. And for people who want to donate and be part of the reconstruction of these monuments, instead of just giving money away, the donor actually gets to individually have an impact on the physical construction of it by submitting their EEG data that manipulates the form, and on the site it can be 3D printed and become part of the reconstruction of the monument. So as a donor, you're not only contributing financially, but you feel a sense of ownership in an object and its physical presence and its location. And this is just an example of a kind of wall and the kind of versatility you get from the manipulation of these blocks and when they're put together as a collective cognition of the past. Thank you.